people think of, oh, it's fun to be like, yeah, mythology and Osiris and, Greek mythology with Zeus and stuff.
Yeah.
But going back, people truly did
They worshipped
believe in
these
these gods.
gods. Yes,
Yeah, like
yes,
it's not
100%.
stories for them.
Correct.
It was real.
But I want to dig a little deeper because that's what we usually do on the Story Geeks show, right?
Right.
Now, I don't want to put a label on you, but just to kind of give us a feel for how this conversation, how the two perspectives are approaching this conversation.
Yeah, no, label me. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to ask you if this is fair, but would you call yourself like a secular humanist, or what's
Yeah.
yeah?
Yeah.
So you're not overly religious. Um, you are, but you are very concerned. In fact, I was going to call you this on the show, and I forgot to when I introduced you. But I think you're one of the people, like in the whole Disney arena. You're one of the, I think, one of the only people, if I'm being honest, that is trying to understand the world through the lens of Disney in a far deeper way than just saying like, how did they make me feel today? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of your vibe. And so you're approaching something like Moon Knight from that perspective. I'm technically approaching it as a Christ follower. And so the MCU has introduced to us another set of mythology, another set, but even leaning more so, I would argue, into spirituality.
That's
Because
really interesting that you say that because I have a totally different take.
oh, really? So
Yeah.
this is good. I like different takes, because what I'm thinking about here is that, like, I even did a little bit of research on this just because I wanted to understand the Egyptian gods a little bit better. But the Egyptian gods are like actually showing up as real. Well, we assume real. Maybe he's just seeing them, and they don't actually exist. But to me, it looks like what he's doing is he's actually seeing the Egyptian gods, which were spiritually worshipped.
Right.
It was one of the biggest empires in history, right? Um,
And you have the Ethan Hawke character who is playing the role of Jesus here.
well, he's playing
Um,
a cult leader for sure.
well, yeah, a cult leader. A lot of people are seeing him as a Jesus-like figure, and
Interesting.
he is the one doling out, the punishments
Yeah,
of God,
yeah,
really, or of the gods from
right.
that perspective. So, I mean, there is definitely a religious atmosphere to the show because you're
Yes,
dealing with mythology, and even though
correct.
people think of, oh, it's fun to be like, yeah, mythology and Osiris and, Greek mythology with Zeus and stuff.
Yeah,
But going back, people truly did
they worshipped
believe in
these
these gods.
gods. Yes,
Yeah, like
yes,
it's not
100%.
stories for them.
Correct.
It was real.
Correct. So yeah, so tell me about, like, what is your what is your perception of using these, because we had the Norse gods, but at this point in history, we tend to think of the Norse gods as like full mythology, even though they were worshipped as well, right? So we've seen the Norse gods, and Thor is a Norse god, so that's a kind of a different take. This is human beings interacting with Egyptian gods. And then we've got this cult figure who I'm curious to hear more about what you think about him being Jesus like, because in my mind he's almost more like the Antichrist like. What do you think about that? Like, how does that hit you? How does that hit you as a person who's a secular humanist, and they're introducing these things that have been really truly meaningful spiritual interactions for people of past generations?
So one of the things when I first saw previews for this show,
Yeah.
right, and I thought about it and doing a little bit of research, realizing that um, the Moon Knight character came from a first appeared in a comic called Werewolf by Night,
Oh, that's
and they're
right.
actually gonna make Werewolf by Night as like a Halloween special.
Oh, cool.
And then we're also gonna get Blade later on, right? So now we're entering the world. I've joked about this, but I think it's kind of true.
Yeah.
Remember, like a few years ago, Universal was like, "Oh, we're gonna have our own MCU, and we're gonna have like
Yeah.
all the Universal monsters combined together in this dark universe."
Yep.
Now the MCU is like, "We're just gonna make the dark universe." Um,
That's true.
like this is the Mummy.
Yeah.
We're gonna have the werewolf story.
Right.
We're gonna have the vampire story with Blade, and then it's all gonna cross mingle.
Yeah.
And you've got kind of witches and wizards and stuff like that
Yeah.
obviously, that have kind of been around. I think that what's interesting about horror and gothic literature,
Yes.
and where that all spawns from, right, is that it's trying to make it goes back to what we desire as humans.
Mm,
Like Dracula is such an iconic character because he was basically, if you want to look at it in biblical terms, right,
right.
he is the sin that everybody kind of desired but was not trying to have. You want to
Yeah,
have
you're
the
trying to practice self-control, but you can't because you're a vampire, right?
right, and
Yeah.
then you get with the gluttony and the all this other stuff.
Right.
Um, we're in that category for sure now,
Yeah.
and I think that that's something that is interesting to see play out.
Yeah.
In this realm, I think that there is, like you're saying, there's a religious aspect to this, but I also think that there is layers to this in terms of the horror side of it, the
Mm,
suspense side of it, and then um the kind of dissociative disorder
yes.
side of it. All of those kind of commingle together
Mm,
and tell a really compelling story.
yeah.
And I don't know how they're all going to match up eventually, and in the future how they're going to attach themselves to werewolves and gods and vampires and things like that.
right.
Um, but all of those kind of creatures and the same, like when you look at um, even modern creature films like Del Toro films, the creature typically is the thing that we're most afraid of, but it's representative of like something that we're genuinely afraid of. So like when you do
Right.
talk about vampires, you're talking about the sins of humanity.
Right.
In this aspect, we might not know exactly what that is yet.
Right.
Um, but I'm really excited to see where it goes and what the show tries to tell us
Yeah.
about ourselves.
Yeah. So there's this interesting thing because I think you're 100% right in terms of like vampires are basically a symbolism for lust, right?
Yep.
The werewolf is symbolism for anger, like in your temper that you can't control, and it's going to happen. And oh, you blew up and you hurt people, and what about that, right? So I think those things are really cool, and I think that's why I think the MCU is getting a little weird. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about with Daryl on Thursday's show, same time on Thursday, Daryl and I are going to talk about how the MCU is adding a lot of the things that we saw in the comics are now showing up in the MCU. So we have Celestials now. We've seen the Watcher show up in What If.
Right.
We have Eternals. Technically, Ego was sort of celestial. He calls himself a celestial, but Ego is obviously a major powerful character. Dormammu is an interdimensional being that we now have, and so now you're seeing like Egyptian gods, which by the way are even referenced in spiritual books of other religions. Like the Egyptian gods are referenced in maybe not by name per se, but they're referenced in the Bible even as being like the Israelite perspective, coming up against the perspectives of the pharaohs. Those pharaohs not only thought of themselves as gods, but were worshiping the gods of Egypt at that time. And it's not like we haven't seen that in the past. Like I mentioned the Norse gods. I mentioned the fact that we had even some of the Egyptian gods in Black Panther were referenced, right?
Right.
So it's not like this is new, but I think it's a really healthy thing to do, especially when we talked about like these are things that people have wrestled with for millennia since the time that there was the first human being, right? However you believe the first human being came about, since the time of that first human being, human beings have been trying to figure out what's the world all about. Are there beings that are superior to us? Are there not? Are they aliens? Are they gods? Are they ghosts? Are they ancestors? I mean, these are like the like stories that I think Marvel should wrestle with because they are literally stories that everybody can wrestle with in their own personal lives. And so I think that the introduction of that's great. I think that showcasing what religion looks like from different perspectives is also great because you talked about the character of Arthur Harrow, which is Ethan Hawke's character, and you talked about him being like he's presenting himself as a person who has the solutions. and yet he's also saying he's serving the will of a character who we have not met yet in episode 1. And he has a really magical little tattoo that tells whether or not people are good or not. And I think all of those things are really interesting because we will encounter those things in our lives, right? Like we will encounter, my wife and I were literally just talking because we're looking for churches to go to in Northern Colorado. And we were just talking about the fact that like, we don't want a church where one of the main focuses is the lead pastor, right? Like, don't give me that. Like, that's not what religion is supposed to be about in our minds. About like, I'm going to follow some dude that's is he supposed to be holier than me? Because I can guarantee you, I've known a lot of lead pastors. They're not any holier than anybody else. Like, they struggle with the same stuff that everybody else. I bet I made that PG, by the way, because I was gonna curse, but I didn't. They deal with the same stuff that we all deal with. And so I like the fact that Marvel is bringing some of these things into, like, we should think about this. We should think about Arthur. And even if he is doing some things that seem like he's predicting the future or making the world a better place, he says his perspective is to bring heaven on earth, right? So there's these 3 questions that I'm going to list here that I think that the show is dealing with that I really like. And then we can move on from this particular set of questions. But the one question that I think is really, really, really fascinating is, who should judge us, and when should they judge us? Because Ammit is going full Minority Report, right? And judging people before their sins are even created. And Arthur Harrow is listening to Ammit in order to pull that off. That's a really, really good question. In a time when we were dealing with COVID and isolated, and now we're integrating back in as a society, who should judge us, and when should they judge us as well, right? Like, that's a really compelling question.
I would also add there really quickly,
Yeah.
is redemption worthy?
Yeah, exactly. Because the lady he kills in episode 1, he's basically saying, you're not going to redeem yourself. You're going to do something bad. And you say you've been good all your life. You must be doing something bad because Ammit says you're dead. So take it easy. Enjoy the afterlife. That's really good. Yeah. I think the other thing that I think we're probably going to talk about more as the series progresses, because this is a really fascinating thing to talk about in the modern day. And that is, what does it mean to be possessed? And in what ways does possession show up in our own lives? Because Steven, as one of the characters in this show, is literally having his body taken over and having it do things that he would not agree with and does not want to happen. And so we're left with this thing of saying, like, what is control, and what does it mean to be possessed by either another personality or even a Egyptian god? And then what does that mean for our freedom? What does it mean for our perspective on the world? Those are really fascinating questions that I think it's kind of hinting at getting into. So I hope they get into it a little bit more. And then the last question I had was, what are we supposed to fight for? Because there's this idea that, like, are we fighting for Ammit? Are we fighting for Khonsu? Are we fighting for, like, Steven's fighting for normalcy? Like,
Right.
like that's his daily struggle, is normalcy. So I think that those are some really interesting questions that I hope that they keep kind of digging into further, because I think the show can definitely go there, and they have all the actors have the chops to do it and all that kind of stuff. So, so yeah, I think that's really good. But okay, so here's my next question. Here's my next question for you. We don't know what Khonsu's goal is yet, but we do know that Khonsu for sure does not respect Steven. Like, he always is like, the idiot is taking over. You know, like, he's like, he definitely doesn't respect him, even to the point where he's like, if Steven were to die, the part of Steven's personality were to die, he would be 100% fine with that happening, right? Like, he doesn't like Steven's personality. At the same time, we just mentioned this earlier, but Ethan Hawke's character believes that the Egyptian god Ammit is trying to bring heaven on earth by eliminating evil people, right? So how are we going to get heaven on earth? Well, we need to eliminate the evil people till all the good people are left. And so he's like testing different people. And so my question is this, and I think this is a pervasive question that the show is asking in episode 1, and I want to turn it on you. And that is, in this series, who is good? Right? Like, there's like lots of people fighting for good, but who actually is good in episode 1 of this series so far?
I mean, in episode 1, we know for a fact, because he gets judged by the scales,
Yeah.
that Stephen is a good person. Is he? I mean, obviously he's one of multiple personalities. So is the entirety of
Right.
Stephen Mark a good person?
Right, because
Or
he said
could
he was a chaos, right? So he said like, and
right,
that speaks to the different characters maybe having influence.
right, and I think like who is a good person is really difficult to say. And I think that that is in general, not even just the show, right?
Right.
Like who really is a good person, or what determines being a good person.
Yeah.
And I'll throw this your way, right? Because you're much more religious than I am. So a lot of people point to how religion,
Mhm.
modern day religion, has been the start of plenty of wars and murder and death.
Right. Oh, so an easy
And
question. So you're giving me an easy question. I see. Yeah.
and they preach,
Right.
love, respect, honor, all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it seems kind of anti the war part of it seems anti-religious, even
Totally.
though all these people are fighting for religion.
Right.
However, if you go back to ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, um, you look at their gods, there is always a god of war. There is
Right.
always someone who is saying there has to be murder to some extent.
Right.
Um, and maybe that's wrong,
Hmm.
but also more realistic.
Right.
And so, are they wrong if we're saying Khonsu or whatever gods come into play in this
Yeah.
show? Are they wrong for being the ones to say somebody's got to take this role of the god of fire, the god of war, the god of death, whatever?
Right.
They're not the devil, and I think
Right.
that's what a lot of people want to associate death and evil with, is the devil, but that's not what mythology has shown us.
Right.
And so I guess this show maybe might be saying, is any of this really wrong
Mm.
according to the mythology
Mm.
of this versus what we know now about modern day religion?
Yeah.
Some of these things would be more wrong.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a really great question because the reason why I'm asking you who's good in the show is because you log into Twitter. Go log into Twitter after this show's over. You're listening to this show. Go log into Twitter and figure out who's good. And good luck to you
Yeah.
because the definition of good is it changes based on the decade that we're living in. Who is good? You would If I would have asked you who is good in Hollywood 2 weeks ago, you'd have been like, Will Smith seems like a pretty good guy.
Right.
um so there's this concept of, I think that one of the things that and one of the reasons I ask you if you feel like you're a secular humanist is because there are people in the world who are secular, what you would call um survival of the fittest, right? And I would say that worldview is sort of like, look, the only thing that you can count on is you getting what you want in life, and therefore who cares about the rest of humanity? Just do what you want to do. And
Yeah, a bit of nihilism there.
exactly. There's a lot of nihilism there, which, by the way, there's actually more nihilism in a lot of religions than you might expect too. But the um the interesting part of that is that as a secular humanist, you're literally trying to figure out what's good consistently. And good is, the definition of good is changing around us all the time, right?
Right.
Um and and so it's one of the reasons I ask you the question and you're asking me the question back. And I would say, like, yeah, this is a fundamental part of the questions we have as humans that I think our stories are trying to help us unravel. Because there's even a portion of another story in the Bible where um, I believe it's I don't want to say the character who it is. I think it's Pontius Pilate, but he says to Jesus something along the lines of "good teacher," and it could be a Pharisee or it could be one of the other religious leaders or one of the other government leaders. And Jesus's answer to that question is, basically you say that I'm good, what is good? Like this is a quintessential human question of like what is good. And I think that like you alluded to it when you're talking about universal monsters, is that there's a sense, call it what you will, but there's a sense that nobody is truly good. Like if you like maybe there are scales and you can kind of like say like, okay, well, yeah, I was better this week than I was last week. So I'm on the upswing, right? But the essence of it is that nobody's perfect and we're all going to hurt other people. And so can you call somebody that hurts other people, even if it's a mistake or you didn't intend it, can you call them good? And it's hard to call that person good. It's hard to say that that's a good person. And I think what the show is saying to us in this is I think that I think we're starting to get the feeling. We tend to, as humans, we tend to, especially in the West, we tend to react to your point about the gods and like our perspective on the gods. In the West, we tend to say, if you're taking away my freedom, that's bad. That's not true everywhere in the world, by the way, but it's very true in the US and in the West. And so we kind of see Arthur Harrow's character as bad off the bat because it's like, dude is these people are free to make their own decisions, and he's saying, no, you actually don't. Your journey is prescribed for you already. Ammit has seen it. You're done, right? So we instantly react to that and be like, that's bad. We shouldn't do that. And then you have a character like Mark who is fulfilling the will of Khonsu. Khonsu doesn't care about Steven, and now we're left with we're left with a hardship of saying like, well, is Mark on board with what Khonsu is trying to do? Because Khonsu doesn't care about Steven. And so I would say if you're gonna label anybody in the show as quote unquote good, it would have to be Steven, which is where you were going down the path with it. But even we don't know if they're entirely good. And I think the fact that this is a question in the show to me is like, I'm so into this show. Like I'm so on board with what this show is trying to accomplish. And I do think that what's really interesting is if they get further into the lore around, because like one of the things that like if you asked me what I would say about like the god of war, right? I would be like the god of war is a representation of collective fear. Right? Like
Sure.
why would we go to war? Why we're sitting in a situation right now where on the other side of the world there is a war happening, and like it's so hard for us with our context to go, why is this war happening, right? And the only way that we know how to talk about it is in terms of saying like, well, that person must be crazy. The problem is that I'm not saying that person isn't crazy, but that person is being driven by something. And could we be driven by the same thing, right? And maybe not to the extent that that person is, but to your point about the universal monsters, what we keep telling ourselves in stories is be careful, because if enough people feel fear the way that you feel fear, if enough people feel like Arthur Harrow and Ammit are on the right side and they're eliminating evil, could we get wrapped up in our own war? And that's not even a question so much of the gods as it is of us. Like
Yeah.
when we feel fear, what are we going to do with that fear? And I think that that's, again, really compelling question to ask, really interesting thing to dive into. And, but give me some more of your thoughts. What is that prompt in you?
Going off of fear,
Yeah.
it's really easy, and this is another kind of storytelling idea in horror
Mm,
and classic like gothic horror,
yeah.
is that fear is really easy to manipulate, right?
Yes.
Like as soon as you feel fear,
Yeah.
you're willing to be comforted by a lot. And
Yes.
and at what point are you falling into, in this case, a false prophet who
Right.
is saying, I'm going to better the world and I can tell you if you're a good person or not.
Right.
There's so many people who, and I'm not going to say whether or not I I don't think it's silly. I don't think that this is a bad thing. I'm not trying to like poo poo on this, right?
Yeah.
But like people go to tarot card readers and fortune tellers and
Oh, yeah.
things like that
Yep.
because they want clarity. They
Hmm.
want to know, and it strives typically from their fears of um death or of whatever in their lives.
Yeah.
Nobody's like, I'm having the greatest day of my life, I'm going to go to a tarot card reader. It's usually like people who are a little bit desperate, a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, and so I'm not trying to say that those people are false prophets, but I do think that we become desperate in our fear and we look for guidance, and there are people that are willing to come in, and we don't know if they're good or bad people. And yeah, like that kind of fascinates me as well. So we'll see what plays out, but there's a lot going on in this show.
Yeah.
A lot of layers, a lot of things. And going back to the Oscars talk and or Emmys, I could see this show, going for that Emmy award because there's so many different layers. It's such a complex story, in the same way
Mm,
that WandaVision was, and that's why WandaVision got Emmy nominations.
right.
They were talking about grief and loss and depression and
Yep.
how that impacts how you project yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and this is kind of the same way.
Yeah. Well, and so you brought up like tarot card reading and like the fear driving people to that. But let's not pretend. Let's not pretend. I'm very comfortable saying this. Let's not pretend that's what doesn't drive people into churches on a Sunday. I mean,
Oh yeah.
there's this sense that I think everybody. I have not met a person yet who doesn't have some form of brokenness. Right? I've got brokenness. I think you've got brokenness. I think everybody down my block. If I walk down the block, I'm gonna find people who are just there's areas of their life where they're broken, and that can make us fearful. That can make us. And then now, fear is not necessarily a bad emotion. Doing something with that fear is not necessarily a bad thing. But on the range of things that you can do with that fear, there are bad things, right? Like there are things you can do in response to your own fear that are not good. And so there's this aspect of saying to ourselves, like, what do we do with fear? What is Steven going to do with fear? What does Mark do with fear? What does Arthur Harrow do with fear? Um, because what we would like is that we would like, oh, here we go, here's a good quote: fear is the mind killer, right? So
Mm.
100% fear is the mind killer. And why is fear the mind killer? Because fear, so special thanks to our if you're listening on audio, that was a Facebook listener. Why is fear the mind killer? Because fear will literally turn off some of your logic, some of how you would normally behave. It will turn it off. It will cause you to react in pure emotion, as opposed to saying, this is not actually in alignment with my values, and I would not like to do this. But your fear will drive you to do it anyways, right? Fascinating stuff. So we're both big fans of Moon Knight. Any other things, Josh, before we close out the Moon Knight conversation?
Oof. You know what? I'm excited to see what comes from the rest of it, from the next 5 episodes.
Yeah.
I think that the MCU television shows that have been on Disney Plus, to me, have suffered from a lot of pacing issues.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be nitpicky about it, I've loved a lot of what they've done, but there have been times where it's like the first few episodes are kind of slow, hang out, and then by the time that you get to like the fifth and sixth episode, or like, excuse me, like the penultimate and final episode, you get to this point where it's like, wow, we got to like really rush through some of this stuff here,
Right.
and they don't let you linger on it enough. And I think that's one of the things that, like, the last episode of WandaVision, right? Like the fight between like the two visions and like what you're left with to think about afterwards
Right.
is really incredible. But then it like cuts scene really hard to the next fight.
Right.
And it would have been great to linger on those moments a bit longer. So I'm hoping that this show paces out some of those storytelling moments,
Mm,
and lingers on some things a little bit more. Although 6 episodes is still not a lot of time, and this show so far has been, slow. The first
right.
episode is a bit slow. It doesn't reveal Mark or the Moon Knight until the end of episode 1.
Right.
So we'll see.
We will certainly see. I am looking forward to it a lot, and I'm glad that we had a chance to have a conversation about it. Daryl and I will be talking about episode 2 on Thursday. We're also on Thursday going to be talking about the power dynamics in the MCU, because there have been like diatribes written about the power dynamics in Marvel Comics. And the more we see those things introduced into our world, like how powerful is an Egyptian god compared to a Norse god? Like, I would like to know that. Like, I want to know like what that looks like.